I'm just gonna check everybody in online and then we'll check everybody in person and then we'll go ahead and get started. Alrighty. How are folks doing? How's the semester going? Okay. If you're just all really quiet, so sometimes that means everybody is already exhausted. So I like to check in. Okay. Double check no one signed on here between now and then. Okay. Awesome. So hopefully you all saw the email. I fixed the syllabus. I still feel like brain fart moment. I'm not really sure what happened with the extra Monday. But basically what this means is that everything will proceed in the same order. It'll just be shifted by a day for a little bit. So instead of having our discussion day today, it will be Monday. And then we'll spend the rest of next week talking about post-Freudian theory. Then we'll have 2 discussion days in a row the following week. The only thing that's a little awkward is fall break will now break up our humanistic theory lecture, but we'll make it work. And then we'll have another discussion review day and then exam 2, which I believe should already be fully posted. If anyone really feels like working on it early. Then we'll do trait theory, learning theory. We'll talk about biological theories. And then I kind of like how this ended up, where you'll have exam 3 and then I'm gone for a day. You'll have sort of just like a relaxing downtime. And then we'll do prep the next week. And this is, I think I said in the email, traditionally how I've done the prep for our simulation is just having a week to do it. I was sort of, something about the schedule was different this year, so I was sort of expanding things, and this was one way I did it. And so this will make it really nice to where we'll have 1 session of the simulation, you'll kind of get your feet wet, then you'll have a break over Thanksgiving, and then we'll come back, you'll have a day to like, what was starting to work, what wasn't working, let me talk to people I'm supposed to be like on the same side as, and then we'll have just like the rest of the semester is the simulation. And I think last year I used less time for the simulation, but I also had fewer folks, and everybody's gonna have to give a speech, and so that takes up more time. So yeah, you can tell it all makes sense. So hopefully that's more helpful to everybody, including me. Okay, let me get us into our PowerPoint here. And I also pulled some videos today to explain more about Freud. I think sometimes those are more helpful. All right, so we just finished talking about neuroses and how that all related to the stages, right? And one of the things that Freud argued happens when the ego is basically trying to compensate for everything else is that it finds these creative ways, essentially, to get around letting things out. And he called these defense mechanisms. Really interestingly, Freud just kind of like came up with these, didn't elaborate on any of them. And then it was his daughter, Anna, who we'll talk about next week, who was the one who really expanded these, detailed these, kind of carried on with his work. So these are ways that we basically try to cope with our unconscious mind without letting it out in full. Repression is probably the most common one. This is just squishing everything down, right? Oh, I don't want to think about that. So it's the process of preventing those unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or urges from reaching conscious awareness. Freud said this is like the most basic of the defense mechanisms, kind of all the other defense mechanisms build off this one. And you avoid anxiety, neuroses, because you basically, your ego keeps you from being consciously aware of any conflict. Just squish it down, out of sight, out of mind, right? But as we've talked about with the sensor being this like not so great screen door, this doesn't work for that long. So there are other ways. Denial is one of these. So not admitting something is wrong with you, or that something's wrong in your environment. But it can be like, oh, something else made me do it, right? I didn't do that because I'm a horrible person. It's a failure to accept responsibility sometimes. This can show up in daydreams and fantasies of how things might have been. An example here might be being unwilling to admit you have an illness, whether that's physical or mental. Reaction formation is maybe one of the healthier ones. And this is expressing an impulse by acting out its opposite. So let's say you're really mad at your boss, he's really mean to you, or she's really mean to you. And in response, instead of like yelling at them or being like, I'm not gonna do that, you're just like, okay, totally, thank you so much. And it's not passive aggressive. I'm doing it in a passive aggressive way, right? But it's just like you do the opposite of what you're actually feeling. Again, not necessarily a healthy expression, but sort of a functional one, if that makes sense. Regression is returning to an earlier developmental stage. And so we've kind of hinted at this when we talked about fixation, right? But regression is related to fixation, but it's not, you're like not all the way fixated and you kind of just go back. So you seek to return to an earlier mode of satisfaction, basically in order to make things simpler, comfort yourself, what have you. So you seek to obtain an earlier mode of satisfaction. Typically, it's when you're really frustrated or really anxious that you'll regress. So let's say you were partially fixated at one developmental stage. We'll use the oral stage as an example. What that means is that later in life, if you come under stress, you'll try to obtain the same type of satisfaction that was appropriate at the oral stage, at that earlier stage of development. So the individual who's partially fixated at the oral stage might continue to seek oral gratification in various ways. Over or under eating, smoking, drinking, biting your nails, chewing on a pen, that type of thing. And this is where regression comes into play. So regression occurs, again, under these conditions of stress. So the people who are fixated find these oral ways to cope. Example here might be maybe a child who's 10 years old but has to go through surgery. That freaks any of us out. And so they might show infantile behaviors like crying, sucking on their thumb, again, oral, right? Sitting in their mother's lap as part of a regression because they're stressed and they're scared. Other defense mechanisms, rationalization is really common among folks like yourselves, folks who are educated. So you deal with an emotion intellectually, rather than letting yourself feel it to avoid the upsets. So an example would be making the excuse that everybody does it, so why should I feel guilty? Displacement is one of the more disturbing ones, where you satisfy some sort of urge with a substitute object. So this can be like a domino effect. So maybe your boss yells at you and you feel like you can't yell back at your boss. So you go home and you yell at your partner, right? And then your partner feels like they can't yell back at you. So then they go and yell at your kid. And then the kid feels like they can't yell at your partner, right? And so they kick the dog. That's very violent. Maybe yell at the dog. We'll go with yell at the dog, right? Displacement, again, to emphasize, is not done deliberately. These are all outside of conscious awareness. And it can be one-off, as they sort of point out here. But it can domino and just sort of make things awkward within your whole family. Projection, very, very common. And this is where you see traits or desires in others that you find most upsetting to yourself. This is something called the false consensus effect, where we tend to assume that other people are similar to us. So if you're extroverted, you'll think everybody else is extroverted too. Having a false consensus about unflattering traits could be projection. So maybe, this is an extreme example, right? But you are someone who's a thief. And then you become paranoid that other people are going to steal from you, right? Or maybe you're someone who, again, unconsciously harbors some prejudices. You might become especially vocal about other people who express those prejudices, right? Maybe you're a congressman or a senator who is a man who sleeps with men, right? Who has sex with men. You might become a very vocal anti-gay advocate, right? Things like this happen quite a bit. Sublimation is the most adaptive defense mechanism. And so this is rechanneling an impulse into something socially desirable, a socially desirable outlet. This one, I don't know. Like, becoming a gynecologist to satisfy sexual urges sounds extra creepy to me. If you just like never let them come out, it's probably fine, right? But if they come out, then you have like a Larry Nassar situation. We don't want to get into that. The other example I have in my notes is chopping wood rather than beating somebody up, right? Going to the gym and using a punching bag instead of actually punching another person. Or going and creating some sort of art when you're angered, right? A lot of people will paint their emotions or write their emotions, create their emotions in music. That's sublimation. Praxis are a really sort of interesting side effect of all these conflicts within the psychodynamic mind. These are leakages from the unconscious mind that manifest as mistakes, accidents, omissions, memory lapses, jokes. Freudian slips are exactly this, when something sort of slips past the censor. The old joke about Freudian slips is it's when you say one thing, but you mean your mother. I know, bad joke, but right? And this is from Freud's belief that everything we do or say has a cause, has an underlying cause in our unconscious. So one of these is forgetting. That suppressing something in the unconscious mind can affect real life. This is usually the result of repression. And Freud believed that if you forgot literally like a physical object, there was a reason for it. So for example, let's say you forget your umbrella in a friend's dorm room. Well, to Freud, that means you just want to go back and see that friend again. So pick up your umbrella. That's actually, I was taking this class with one of my good friends. And while we were in this class, he did that. He was like, I guess I just wanted to see you. Right? And it was probably just he left it, right? But it's kind of a fun idea to be like, I'm not forgetful, I just want to see my friends dead, right? Slips are unintended actions or words. And this is my favorite story from taking this class as an undergrad. As I mentioned, Professor Levine is like one of my heroes, one of my greatest mentors. And when he was teaching us about Freud, I believe this was the context for the I Hate Freud quote, he was telling us about something called pseudocyesis. Does anyone know what that is? Yeah, I didn't either. So pseudocyesis is where someone with a uterus believes they are pregnant, like truly believes it, even though they could take a pregnancy test and it's going to come out negative. But your body will actually start to take on some of those symptoms. You might like gain weight. You might get some nausea, like morning sickness. And what Professor Levine was trying to explain is your breasts may become tender because that's a symptom of pregnancy. But what he said is, and breasts become tenured, which if you're not familiar with that term, it's how you progress within the field of academia. And he was a board writer. He wrote a lot on the board. So he was holding either a marker or a piece of chalk. And after he said it, he like caught himself and he stopped. And he looked at all of us and he threw his chalk in the air and he just walked out of it. And we all just were looking at each other laughing. And he was like, I hate Freud. And so like sometimes when I'm teaching about Freud, I feel like I should not quote this, it hasn't happened yet this year. I feel like this is like the curse of Freud, and I make all kinds of weird Freudian slips, right? And so that's what happened to him there. He told two of my other mentors, Dr. Linda Smolak and Dr. Sarah Mernon, right after class, and apparently they just like died laughing at him. So at least he had a sense of humor they did too about it. And he was like the most supportive person of women in, like he and Linda Smolak got to Kenyon where I went at the same time. And they actually compared paychecks and realized he was getting paid more. And like he went with her to be like, no, this isn't acceptable. So like it's just like he got this sexualized idea about tenure. These, as I mentioned, they're often in speech, but they can also be in action. So there's an example of athletes who fail at times when they feel ambivalent about winning. The most clear example of this I can think of is before LeBron James went to Miami. It was the first time he left the Cavs in Cleveland. They were in the playoffs and he just wasn't playing well. And I don't think it was on purpose. I don't think he was like purposely throwing the games. He probably just had this ambivalence, right? Slips happen more likely when we're tired, when we're not paying attention, when we're in a hurry, or we're excited about something. It's like that sensor kind of is like a little more free swinging door and stuff slips out. Humor was something that Freud talked about quite a bit. Freud thought that humor allowed us to express forbidden impulses in a controlled manner. So express forbidden impulses in a controlled manner. But he did distinguish between good jokes and bad jokes. So a good joke is where a surprise is used to let otherwise problematic thoughts and impulses to be enjoyed without causing anxiety. And it's really interesting because like we would not think of these jokes as good jokes, right? These are jokes that might be racist or sexist, but Freud said like in his time, right? That was okay. You're just letting forbidden impulses out. It doesn't hurt anybody. Now we know it does, right? He said bad jokes are when you just sort of blatantly do that, right? And there's no forbidden impulse. It's too direct to be surprising. It can be about too sensitive an area, like politics. And this means that when you're making bad jokes, you're not suppressing your aggressive tendencies. And you might make even like violent jokes, rape jokes, things like that. But in general, from the psychoanalytic perspective, humor is good. Humor is a good coping mechanism. And this came to be true in a lot of therapies going forward. So like, Adler used humor. He's a psychodynamic person. We're going to talk about Albert Ellis purposely used puns like "don't should yourself," things like that. Aaron Beck was very humorous in his sessions. So people took this idea and like took out the sexist racist part of it, but we're like, humor in general can be used as a nice coping strategy. All right, so psychoanalysis itself, that term really became synonymous with Freud's therapy. And first and foremost, psychoanalysis is this therapeutic technique. It was developed especially to help individuals with hysteria. Freud trended to treat upper middle class and upper class women who were suffering from hysteria. And it used observation, analysis, interpretation, insights, and trying to help the client work through the problem. It was also a new way of thinking about the mind, an intellectual movement. Again, this idea of like unconscious mental forces. No one had really talked about this in any way before. The importance of childhood. Around this time, it was just like children are little adults, right? There wasn't an idea that like we should let kids be kids. And unfortunately, particularly for lower class children, a lot of the children at that time would be working from a very young age, right? And what we would call sweatshops today. The role of society in health and in psychopathology. And then the idea of therapy itself as an intellectual quest, that you're trying to find out knowledge about yourself as well as find healing. So the therapy was this search for knowledge. The key feature of psychoanalysis is that it was set up both sort of abstractly and physically so that the therapist became the focus of the problems. And so here is Freud's actual couch. This is, I believe, the picture I took when I was there. And so Freud or whatever psychoanalyst would sit in this chair behind the couch. The client would lay on the couch. And the idea was the client couldn't see the therapist. So the therapist became a blank slate that the client could project everything on, feel more comfortable opening up to the therapist, right? Because they're just sort of in their own element. Some techniques that were used in psychoanalysis. Transference is where information you uncover in the therapy is transferred to or projected onto your psychoanalyst. This becomes problematic sometimes because you might start to see your therapist in like a sexual way if you're dealing with relationship issues in therapy. Sometimes it's a lot less problematic. It's like you see your therapist as like a father figure. So you can imagine the good and bad ways can go, right? I had a supervisor who was teaching one of our didactics when I was on my internship year, and he was talking about a client he had who, like, one of the ways she coped was to just like go out and have random sex. And she thought, like, this is a defining feature of me, that I'm just gonna have sex with everyone I know. So he looked at his watch and he was like, we've known each other like 6 months. Isn't it time for us to have sex? And I remember the co-lead with him was the head of the women's unit at the VA, and she just went like this. I looked at him and was like, what? And she was like, what would you have done if she said yes? And he was like, oh, I knew she wouldn't. That's really problematic. Like, that's using humor in a really weird way, right? Other example of how transference can interfere. While I was on internship, unfortunately, one of our psychiatrists, and she was a psychiatrist who did therapy, a lot of psychiatrists will just prescribe meds. She found out she was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so she had to step away from her clients. And one of her clients got transferred to me. This client had already made sort of a transference onto this psychiatrist who was a woman in her 60s, So she saw her as a mom figure. I was like 27 or 28 at the time, and she was in her 40s. She could not have that same transfer with me, right? So we actually had a lot of conflict at first. And we really had to work through that, right? And figure out a working relationship for ourselves. And she was actually one of my clients who made the most progress once we worked past that. She was actually the only client who was like, what are you doing after you leave us, right? Like she was genuinely interested in me, so we formed that good bond, and I didn't mind sharing that I was going into academia. So transference can be beneficial, but it can also be interfering, right? Countertransference can be really problematic. And this is when the therapist's feelings are projected back on the client. This can be really interfering in therapy, but it occurs in all kinds of therapy. You aren't going to have a perfect neutral feeling about every client you ever see, right? Sometimes you just don't like the client. How do you work through that? Do you work through that, or do you transfer that? The one client I ever saw with narcissistic personality disorder, I did his intake, and then our supervisor was like, had told us you're allowed to say no to one client, like transfer them to somebody else after the intake. And I was like, he is my one. Like, I cannot with this guy. Like, this is just, I'm not going to be helpful to him, right? And that was probably the best thing I did for him, because my friend that ended up seeing him was very empathetic and supportive, right? Whereas I don't know if I could have been. And so another example is sometimes you're sitting in therapy and a client that you've previously had a really good relationship with, you just start to feel annoyed with them. And that's something to like process with colleagues. What's going on now? And then sometimes it's helpful to bring up with the client. This is how I'm feeling right now when you're talking about this particular issue. Has anyone else in your life ever expressed that to you? And a lot of times they'll be like, oh yeah, people get annoyed with me when I do this. Well, let's talk about why that is, right? And how we can start changing your approach. Not that you shouldn't be yourself, but think about better ways to do it, right? This is the reason that all psychoanalysts were also supposed to undergo their own analysis. They were supposed to have done that, been fully analyzed before they even started seeing clients, because Freud thought they needed to work through all this stuff, so countertransference wouldn't be an issue. Of course, at first, only Freud could do the psychoanalysis, so he psychoanalyzed himself. I don't know how effective that was, right? But then the other weird thing to me, again, think about it in the context of the Oedipal and the Electra complex, is he psychoanalyzed his own daughter, Anna Freud, because there was no one else to do it yet. I can't imagine, right? Free association is a large part of what happened during traditional psychoanalysis. Literally, the person just sort of laying on the couch and saying whatever comes to mind. This was thought to be a way to get to the unconscious. If the person just talked and talked enough, stuff would start to come out. And then the therapist's role was interpretation. So recognizing the conflicts, helping patients to discover compromises, things along those lines. And I have a couple different videos here. So this first one, once we get past the ad, do this. This first one is actually Freud talking, which is really cool. It's the only known recording, I think, of him that has kind of lasted.
I started as a neurologist trying to bring relief to my neurotic patients.
So one of the things I'll say here is that this was done by the BBC. So this was after he was in London. So this was when he already had the jaw cancer, which is why it's a little hard to understand him, I think. Plus, the recording quality is not great.
I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious, the role of instinctual urges, and so on. Out of these findings grew a new science, psychoanalysis, a part of psychology, as a new method of treatment of the neurosis. I had to pay heavily for this bit of good luck. People did not believe in my facts and thought my theories unsavory.
So again, that is going back to this idea of Victorian culture, being very puritanical, right? It also, I think this little snippet kind of shows a little bit of Freud's egotism, right? He was like, I found facts, right? He found theories, right? Other people didn't believe my facts. Interesting.
Resistance was strong and unrelenting. In the end, I succeeded, but the struggle is not yet over. Sigmund Freud.
And so again, yeah, the struggle is still not over, right? Because most people now would not necessarily agree with that. And then I found this funny film portrayal of this. So we're gonna have Freud and we're gonna have Joseph Breuer working with a client with hysteria. So a little bit of like what hypnosis and therapy might have looked like.
Baroness, may I present Dr. Freud? A young colleague and lecturer in neuropathology who has recently returned from a 6-month visit to the Salpêtrière.
So, you have been working under my beloved Charcot. Do tell me, is his wife still fornicating with hussars?
I failed to inquire, madame. Dr. Freud has brought with him some equipment modeled on the latest developments in electrotherapy from Paris.
Indeed. Charmant.
How is the arm today?
The arm is clay, unfeeling.
So she has hysteria. She has some inappropriate emotions, right? She's got this arm that is physically not moving, but physically actually fine. So her stress is being translated into these physical symptoms.
But the pain here in my cheeks has gone. I feel it like a slap sometimes. A slap that stays and glows. A slap I may have deserved, but never received. Strange. I dreamt I was a statue last night. I'd forgotten. A statue of the Madonna. A plaster statue by the roadside.
If you'll permit me, Baroness.
And the Emperor rode by. He had my father's face. He raised his hat and I heard him say, "Hail, Diana the Huntress!" Oh, it made me laugh to think of it when I woke up. And yet, there was something in his tone. He had my father's voice, deliberate, mocking, as if there was some meaning in the way he said it. Diana. Anna. My name is Anna. You may begin.
So they're gonna try like electrostimulation of her arm. This is one of his most famous patients, Anna O, who was really sort of trapped by her hysteria. And you could see from that clip, again, a representation, where Freud got some of his ideas, like dream interpretation, right? So this was one of the most important things to Freud that he focused on, interpreting, analyzing within his therapeutic context. And he considered dreams to be the royal road to the unconscious. This is how you got to the unconscious. And so what Anna O started by describing there was the manifest content of her dream. What she just dreamt, seeing the emperor, riding a horse, being called Diana. So the manifest content is what is made manifest to you, the dreamer, what you see, what you experience. It's what you actually remember from the dream. And then Freud would use free association to get that person to start to analyze the dream. So this leads to issues, this gets under surface, this gets to what he called the latent content of the dream. And this is what's residing beneath in potential or unexpressed form. And at the end of that little speech, Anna O was starting to get it, right? The idea that Diana, right? Other things, certainly the use of mythological imagery is something that Freud would have played with, and his student Jung, who we'll talk about next week, would have really been into. So the belief for latent content was that you couldn't express these thoughts in consciousness. They were too powerful. And so they came out in these like symbolic representations in your dreams. They were the id, basically. They were your urges, wishes, desires, passions, and that dreams allowed you to safely discharge this tension, all those things you've been repressing. And Freud thought that wishes that might be activated during the day came out at night in your dreams. So the dream work was what Freud did in therapy, and what happened within people's brains as well. So your brain would do the dream work to transfer from the latent contents to the manifest content. So to turn the, I think my father wants to kill me, right, extreme example here, into someone calling you a different name. Your brain disguises things, compromises things, converts things to other imagery. It becomes wish fulfillment. Freud believed that it was the ego that did this, the censor that was doing this. And the mechanisms that were implicated here are condensation, which is not like dew on the ground, right? In this case, it is one dream symbol standing for several things, several associations, several ideas. Then there's displacement, and this is a chain of associations that runs sideways, that makes the manifest content unrecognizable. So somehow your father ends up getting represented by a bucket. All right, and there was like maybe 10 steps before you got there. Symbolism is that disguise, sort of better keep that one to myself, right? And then secondary revision is rearrangement of the seemingly incoherent elements of the dream into a narrative, into a story. This involves logical and temporal reorganization, to kind of show temporal sequence, causality. Above all, secondary revision is instrumental to dream sort of censorship, trying to keep stuff latent, right? And may produce omissions or additions. The dream interpretation is done by the analyst and is helping the patient get from the manifest content to that latent content. A good analyst would do this based on lots of evidence, lots of analysis, like a good lawyer. You compile the evidence, you build the case, you don't just analyze the first dream they came up with ever as like a really deep thing. Great Levine quote here, you know, the analyst really just focusing in every move you make, every case you make, every step you take, we'll be analyzing you. Obviously, as I've alluded to many times before, a lot of modern day criticisms of Freud, and really a lot of contemporary criticisms of Freud when he was still alive. Freud's theories, as we mentioned several times, were scandalous at the time in the Victorian era when people didn't talk about sex. In addition, this was a time of people thinking about freedom of the soul, civil rights, and Freud's theories seem to suggest we don't have free will, that everything is dictated by our unconscious. People didn't like that. There's also complexity. These are really complex, intricate theories. And if you recall, way back our first lecture, one of the things we said that makes a good theory is parsimony, or keeping it simple. Freud's ideas are extremely complex. They're definitely not the simplest explanation. Using the case study method obviously can be problematic in its own right. So Freud's research was all single case studies. He never did an experiment. He never did a correlational study. Part of the issue with that is that you cannot publish every detail, right? He had to de-identify his folks because of confidentiality. So we, the reader, don't have the full story. You also can't analyze case studies with statistics. Freud's constructs also had really vague definitions. So usually in science, we want operational definitions, which allow us to define things based on operations and procedures by which it can be identified and measured. And you simply cannot do that for a lot of the concepts within psychoanalysis. How do you measure psychic energy? You can't, right? And this leads into our next big criticism, and this I think is the biggest modern one, is untestability. In order for a theory to be good scientifically, it has to be able to be tested. You have to be able to do research on it. You have to be able to disprove it. You can't test it at all. You can't just confirm it. These things are so abstract. There's no way to actually get at them, right? And that's really one of the biggest modern criticisms. There's also sexism in his theories. Again, partially a result of his time. But Freud, like many doctors of his time, males were just the norm, and females were aberrations, abnormal versions of male models. Again, the idea that Freud had that the Oedipal complex was just the same for women, right? It was his student Jung who came up with the Electra complex. And Freud thought because girls couldn't identify with their fathers, who were like the model members of society, right? Actually out and participating in the world. They were identifying with their mothers, who at that time were confined to the home. He thought that girls could never actually develop a superego. And so they were deformed in some way. And he thought that the only way for women to resolve their penis envy was to grow up, get married, and give birth to a male child, because then she possesses the phallus. Very problematic, right? Freud also based the vast majority of his research on working with adults. Despite us talking about little Hans as one of his case studies, Freud very rarely worked with children. It was actually his daughter who did most of the work with children. So he based all of his ideas on what his patients told them about their pasts. And we know, just what we know about human memory now, right? That it's not infallible. And people are going to remember things in a biased way. People are going to purposely not remember things, even looking at in the context of Freud's own theories, right? There's stuff we keep unconscious. And so his own ideas came from his past as well. Another problem that I realized I don't have a bullet point for here, but it's kind of related, is that he changed his theories a lot. And not always because of scientific reasons. So for example, early in his career, he wrote very clearly about how he thought the vast majority of his female historical patients had hysteria because they had been abused, sexually or physically, by men close to them, a father, an uncle, something along those lines. And women had told him these stories. Later in his career, he walked that back. Not because he suddenly believed women hadn't had those experiences, but because the people who paid his bills were the people who had abused them. It's really problematic, right? Still, as I mentioned at the beginning, the reason that we still talk about him is he kind of kicked off everything else. But also that he tried to explain everything. And he's one of the few theorists we'll talk about who really had that trying to explain everything. I found a couple little videos about criticism of Freud, so I thought we could watch those. Again, it's always good to get perspective that's not just mine.
Working in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, he began his career as a neurologist before pioneering the discipline of psychoanalysis. He proposed that people are motivated by unconscious desires and repressed memories, and their problems can be addressed by making those motivations conscious through talk therapy. His influence towers above that of all other psychologists in the public eye. But was Sigmund Freud right about human nature? And were his methods scientific?
Order, order. Today on the stand we have... Dad?
Ahem, no, Your Honor. This is Dr. Sigmund Freud, one of the most innovative thinkers in the history of psychology, an egomaniac who propagated pseudoscientific theories.
Well, which is it?
He tackled issues medicine refused to address. Freud's private practice treated women who suffered from what was called hysteria at the time, and their complaints hadn't been taken seriously at all. From the women with depression he treated initially to World War I veterans with PTSD, Freud's talking cure worked, and the visibility he gave his patients forced the medical establishment to acknowledge their psychological disorders were real.
One thing I'll say here, and again, they're trying to simplify it because it's a cutesy little video, is the term PTSD didn't exist back then. They would have called it something like shell shock or like post-war something.
He certainly didn't help all his patients. Freud was convinced that our behavior is shaped by unconscious urges and repressed memories. He invented baseless, unconscious, or irrational drivers behind the behavior of trauma survivors and caused real harm.
How's that?
He misrepresented some of his most famous case studies, claiming his treatment had cured patients when in fact they had gotten worse. Later therapists influenced by his theories coaxed their patients into recovering supposedly repressed memories of childhood abuse that never happened. Lives and families were torn apart. You can't blame Freud for later misapplications of his work. That would be projecting. Plenty of his ideas were harmful without any misapplication. He viewed homosexuality as a developmental glitch. He coined the term penis envy, meaning women are haunted for life by their lack of penises. Freud was a product of his era. Yes, some of the specifics were flawed, but he created a new space for future scientists to explore, investigate, and build upon. Modern therapy techniques that millions of people rely on came out of the work he started with psychoanalysis. And today, everyone knows there's an unconscious. That idea was popularized by Freud.
I do have to say, this idea that like talk therapy started with Freud is the part that really resonated with me when I did visit the Freud Museum and I was in the room with like the couch. Like it was very strange. It almost felt like a sacred space, right? Like therapy started here. And that's why eventually I ended up getting my PhD, right? Like it's just really interesting to think about.
Psychologists today only believe in a cognitive unconscious, the fact that you aren't aware of everything going on at a given moment. Freud took this idea way too far, ascribing deep meaning to everything. He built his theories on scientific ideas that were outdated even in his own time, not just by today's standards. For example, he thought individual psychology is derived from the biological inheritance of events in ancient history, And I mean ancient, like the Ice Age or the killing of Moses. Freud and his closest allies
That was actually more young. I'm not really trying to like defend Freud, but if we're going to be accurate in our criticism, let's be accurate in our criticism.
actually believed these prehistorical traumas had ongoing impacts on human psychology. He thought that the phase of cold indifference to sexuality during pubescence was literally an echo of the Ice Age. With fantastical beliefs like these, how can we take him seriously? Any renowned thinker from
So just again, like I really like this sort of let's bring Freud to trial and see. Right, feel free to watch the rest of that later if you want. We do have a discussion on Monday, but there's only one reading for it. It's only something Freud wrote himself. So come prepared. We'll do some activities and do a traditional discussion assignment.